I'm honored to be here. I have one job as the moderator, and that's to speak as little as possible so that you can hear as much information as you can from our amazing panelists. So I'd like to welcome to the stage our panelists. Hold on, let me make sure I get this properly pronounced. So for the panel today on diversity, we have Keisha Howard, gamer and geek culture enthusiast and creator of Sugar Gamers. We have Paula Angela Escuadra from GlassLab. And Rebecca Heineman, expert game designer and National Space Invader champion. So I just actually wanted each one of you to take time to introduce yourself, but also explain to us why you're passionate about diversity.
I'll start. Well, I got into the video game industry.
I guess I can sit here. Sorry. I thought you were going to sit there. Sorry.
I got, excuse me. I got into the video game industry because I was entered into and won the Atari National Space Invaders tournament in 1980. Since, making me one of the first pro gamers ever. And that led to a career where I was writing articles in Electronic Games Magazine about how to beat video games. And then eventually they found out that I had learned how to program a computer all by myself and ended up doing Atari 2600 cartridges for Avalon Hill. And then I'll skip forward to some of my notable accomplishments. I'm the creator of Bard's Tale 3, The Thief of Fate, and Dragon Wars. And I'm currently now the CEO of Old School, a video game company.
How am I supposed to beat that?
We're not a competition.
Shine. Yes. Hi, my name's Paula. I am the product engagement lead for GlassLab, or Collective Shift. I started out my career in user acquisition and digital marketing, so making behavioral models focused on consumption. The realization that games are implicitly learning experiences led me to education and workforce readiness. And so I currently work at a nonprofit that's focused on taking commercial AAA titles and indie games into tools for learning for middle school and young adults.
I'm Keisha Howard. I'm sort of a clumsy entrepreneur. I accidentally started Sugar Gamers after realizing there were no communities of gamers for me to belong to in 2009 in Chicago. So Sugar Gamers became one of the largest social casual gaming communities in Chicago, and now we're opening up a gaming studio this year.
Excellent. Okay, so let's jump right in. In 2015, Dean Takahashi said the following in his keynote at the GamesBeat Summit in San Francisco: "I would not recommend the gaming industry to my daughters." That was then, this is now. Tell me what one thing you have improved and one solution-oriented approach that could tackle existing issues that still exist.
Well, our solution was to found a video game company that was founded by 4 women.
That's awesome.
Our company, Old School, was founded by Susan Manley, formerly of EA and Strategic Simulations, and Maureen Starkey, formerly of Westwood, and Janelle Jakeways, who was formerly of Coleco, and what was it, TSR, and id Software. And our entire company was founded by us being at a party in which we were all grousing about how nobody wants to hire old women anymore. And so that's when the idea was floated of, well, we're going to make a company which hires old women.
Awesome.
Well, at least for me, I go and speak at schools all the time, and I deconstruct the gaming industry for a lot of young women because gaming is more than esports. So having this conversation and allowing them to see all the facets in which they can contribute their creative talents to definitely opens up their eyes to move beyond just the horror stories they hear about, like being a woman in this space. And then, there's me that represents being a woman in this space that gives them a little bit more encouragement as well.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely translates in a lot of the educational work that we do today. In my experience, I've run into many game developers who worked in the commercial game space for a really long time and then had children, and then have been forced in a way to substantially shift the way they perceive the narratives that they're creating and the stories that they're developing and the characters that they bring to life. And I see just as many kids in our playtests who come up really excited because they've seen a character that looks like them and talks like them for the first time, and it's been able to kind of bring them the hero that they've been looking for. We've all been, at one point or another, / every day, been that kid at the playground who doesn't know how to identify with the people around them, doesn't feel represented, and can feel alone. And games and the development of games that have a very interesting new way of looking at diverse narratives has been really helpful for breaking down those barriers and kind of creating a shared context for all of these kids.
So what's interesting is GamerGate was in 2014, and of course we're still kind of dealing with that too, but how have things changed? Have things like the Me Too movement been impactful for the games industry?
Well, now that there's so much money, especially going into esports, young kids, just people in general, are starting to understand that if they're going to create a lucrative career out of gaming, they need to act right. So hiding behind, I'm gonna mispronounce this name, mispronounce this word, anonymity. No, I didn't
Anonymity.
do it. There we go. Thank you, Paula. So that's no longer, if you want to have like the successful career in gaming now with Twitch and streaming, and that being such a huge part of what the gaming industry is now, I think people understand that they can no longer really hide their behaviors successfully, or people are calling the bad behaviors out. So it's not as easy as it once was to be a troll. It's still definitely out there, do not get me wrong. But because there are more and more people that want to have a lucrative and successful career in gaming, they aren't they're not publicly displaying their troll abilities. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of cultural shift that still needs to happen, because if we think about the Me Too movement and Time's Up in context, Me Too was created over a decade ago. And we're just now getting to a point where we're acknowledging that these lived experiences are happening, let alone being able to do something about it. So the way in which we have to think about our hiring, thinking about how we're bringing in local communities in our development, and thinking about how we scale that is definitely a challenge. How we translate likes, comments, shares into policy change, into our company culture, is something that we're still struggling to figure out.
Mm-hmm. One of the things is that, as you brought up, is that to be a pro gamer is that you give up some of your privacy. It's just the way of the beast, especially now with esports being televised and so forth, is one where if you wish to have a career in esports, you need to be on your best behavior whenever you play, and no matter what rounds or how private you think that these games you're playing in are, they're not. On the internet currently, which wasn't true a few years back, is everything is recorded. No matter what you do, what you say, someone out there is going to have a recording of it, and it's going to come back to haunt you if you, to paraphrase Will Wheaton, don't be a jerk.
I think that's really interesting. You both kind of bring up this that as gamers become more part of the limelight, the light's exposed, and you kind of is the disinfectant of this. But I feel like there's still a huge amount of toxicity in this culture of gaming fandom. And have you guys seen any other solutions that can really address this? Or even more interesting, can gaming itself be a possible solution for this? Like, can we have games that teach people to be better behaved? If the games weren't about violence and killing other people, could they maybe promote civility? Is that even possible?
I mean, I think that right now, if you aren't working in the gaming industry, you're an outsider looking in, the esports aspect of the video game industry is so loud that you would think that those are the only types of games that exist. esports games and first-person shooters, when there are so many different types of games that already exist. And if those were to be if those games were to be highlighted and given the same types of limelight that esports is currently getting, as far as like their intellectual merits, their abilities to teach some level of emotional intelligence and critical thinking. There are so many games like that, but they're just not in our media as popular games. Like, for example, like before, when video games were being advertised, you'd always see like little boys playing the games, right? So like as the gaming industry is reflecting the consumer base, which is half women, now you see marketing that includes women. We still need to see marketing that includes different types of games that are just as, that have like that significant application that changes or helps to modify behavior, that helps for people to think about things in a wider perspective. Yeah. But right now, we're kind of relegated to like 10 or 15 games that keeps getting,
And the formula being the same too. Yeah, I mean that raises a really interesting point about creating, like the way to remove unconscious bias or address conscious bias comes from the way in which you're portraying the characters, and if you're doing so in an authentic way. Authenticity is really difficult to evaluate and measure, so it's something that has to, you have to have a community of people who are going to support you to figure out what makes sense. But I mean, there's a good thing to consider when you're developing a character that could potentially change the perception that a player may have towards a different race or gender or sexuality, comes from identifying that it has to go beyond just checking the diversity box. So it has to be a strong character and a representation of the cultures that encompass that character, not a character that happens to be strong. And that's something that we run into when we have, black characters or female characters that happen to be these really strong, amazing generals in games, and that technically counts as representation. But there's no complexity in it to actually make a player identify with what that character is going through. So finding a balance between the two can really help enrich that narrative and that experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, see, like you brought up the point of like first-person shooters and really violent is the fact that it's not the content of the game per se that really is the problem. It's the toxicity of the players themselves when they believe that they're truly anonymous. Because when someone does believe they're anonymous, then certain aspects of their personality that they keep hidden comes to the forefront, in which their misogyny, their racism, their homophobia comes to surface, because when this behavior comes out, and then they find that there's no repercussions for this, then it encourages them to continue this to the point where people of these, minorities tend to not want to play the game. Recently, there was an incident at some gaming convention where a game developer was playing this brand new first-person shooter, and a female reporter was playing as well. And then he shot her character, and then went ahead and did this thing called teabagging, which is where your character gets on top of the dead body and bounces up and down. Now, for some men, they think that's funny. But for a woman, that's unfortunately triggering, because sadly, as women, we have to have our guard up all the time due to unfortunate realities of being a woman. Mm-hmm. So from the developer's point of view, he just thought this was funny. But from the woman's point of view, it wasn't, and you have to be aware of these things. Other aspects is that in the game narrative itself, I've seen games, not so much today because they're being more aware of it, but in the past, it was quite common for games in which the protagonist goes around and makes comments about women's jiggly bodies, or in some cases, doing things to females without their permission is actually a goal in the game, which is teaching bad behavior. Thankfully, this is now being removed from games because it's not pushing a bad narrative.
Sorry, I totally dropped the ball as my job as moderator. We were supposed to start with a video that was supposed to introduce the idea of diversity and all of that. So let's take a break halfway through and now do that. My bad. Yes, we will dance for you while they're queuing.
Cue the commercial.
I totally forgot.
The emergent game industry where creativity
had one job. Had one job.
It's okay, just do this.
A collective network welcoming all. Embracing collective intelligence, the reward diversity brings. Join us and become a source for change. Leadership for diversity. Join us. leadershipfordiversity.com #lead4diversity.
Okay, I can't even see the video. One last thing I'd also like to say before Leadership for Diversity, everyone should go to the website and check it out. They actually have actionable items that you can do and you can think about and follow to kind of put leadership for diversity to actual practice. So it's not just about like, information, but there's actually principles and things that you can take home and do and put into practice with your companies to increase diversity. So very, very cool stuff. So getting back to this conversation, I thought you brought up a very interesting point, this idea of like teabagging and if there are toxic behaviors, is there any onus on the game makers to try to like either prevent that or understand that it's happening and give negative incentives to prevent it? Like,
Yes, yes, yes.
and how do we do that? I feel like, I remember a lot of people talking about using NLP and voice recognition to detect if people are using slurs and doing things about that, but I haven't seen any of those really come into fruition. What can we do there? What's being done? Maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
In the past, I've actually been years ago, I've been actively contacting many companies, asking them to do something about this, but in most cases, they would just say there is no problem. Mm-hmm. But now, currently, companies are actively putting up, or in their games, in the websites, the ability for you to mark a player as being toxic. And then at that point, after that player gains so many reports, mm-hmm. that an employee at the firm will then look at that person's record or maybe even listen in on some of the conversations and make a determination about whether or not this person should be given a warning or a banning. This goes a long way to get rid of toxic behavior because the main issue about toxicity in gaming is the fact there has been no repercussions until now. And in pro gaming, the esports, we're actually starting to see some players being thrown out of the game because of sexual harassment. And this is going a long way to let the message be known that this behavior is not to be tolerated anymore.
Anything else to add?
I mean, well, for me, I think that one of the biggest things that could change toxicity amongst players is having more perspectives and storytelling in gaming. So if your team is somewhat homogenous, there's nobody to like check, there's no checks and balances because everybody knows each other and, everybody is friends and everybody is similar. And right now the games industry needs a new sort of crop of people to tell their stories and to have their insights as gamers, but also in the executive positions in gaming companies. So, how would you know if you've been making games or playing games the same way all your life, and you never really needed to have like a woman's opinion or a person of color there to be like, that's kind of offensive. If there's nobody like that to say anything during the development of games, then it can become problematic then. And at the end of the day, diversity is like, it's the word that everybody wants to feel good about, but it's really about, it's not just socially impactful, but it's fiscally responsible. You want your game to be as compelling and marketable to the largest amount of people that you can while still remaining authentic. Means that you probably want to have a diverse team that will appeal to these different markets. And it's incredibly important to lean in and find those people to diversify your team. So when things happen in a game, there can be that individual there to be like, you might not want to do that. So.
And Yeah, and just to piggyback off that, it's not just the creative process of developing a game, it's QAing the game. I mean, it was just in 2015 when consumers started to flag that certain automated motion faucets didn't recognize darker skin tones. When Google Glass was first being developed, the QA team was predominantly comprised of white men, and so the founder, who had a very thick accent, couldn't get his voice recognized. So there's a lot of potential financial loss and social and branding loss that happens if you don't have those pieces in mind. So it's really good to just do that and cover your bases and just make sure that you're addressing, your core audience and what they're looking for.
Diversity, it's safer this way.
And financially safe, yes.
Well, I think that's a great segue into the next. I mean, diversity is not just good for socially. It's good for finance. It's like Black Panther is a great example of how powerful diversity can be, both for good, but also for the bottom line, and that's why people should pay attention. So my question is, Black Panther, good on showing diversity for not just the creative, and on the production side. Can gaming have its Black Panther moment? Is there that opportunity? How do we create that moment for gaming?
Who would like to go first? I mean,
I volunteer as tribute.
Yes.
The Black Panther movement technically is already underway. The very fact that now modern especially with esports leading the way, is that unlike professional physical sports, where your body type and your athleticism matters more than your intellect, in esports, it's really a matter of how fast can you think on your feet and how fast can you click that mouse button. And that really opens up the gaming to be, participation to a much, much larger group of people. I mean, people in wheelchairs are now being, rabid League of Legends players because they're able to compete at the professional level. The thing, though, is that it doesn't matter whether you're black, white, female, male. It doesn't matter. As long as you can go ahead and aim that gun and just blow the crap out of that person, if you do it better than others, then you're in the league. But sadly, there's still people who are still subscribing to their racism, misogyny, etc., and they're bringing their toxicity to the game. Now, thankfully, I have a personal friend who is a League of Legends player right now, and she's pro, and she's an intersex woman, and she, at one of the tournaments, was insulted by another player. The people who ran the tournament immediately threw out that toxic player. And it made my friend very welcome at the event because she was actually thinking of quitting the sport because of the toxicity she saw. But when she saw that at the actual venue, that they were actually listening to her and taking her and researching that this indeed actually happened, and then throwing out the toxic player, making it very clear to any other player, this is no more. We have to be inclusive. Everybody has a seat at the table. All that matters is, do you suck or you don't suck?
I mean, I think the merit. Oh, sorry. I was going to say, I think a huge part of the merit of Black Panther is that the film itself not only took into account the different African nations and their representation and their culture and their language, but also did a lot to make itself very self-aware. So the power dynamics that would impact Wakanda were represented differently than, say, in Thor Ragnarok. Like, for an example that I can say is that in Thor Ragnarok, it's very much like a hierarchical throne room that you see in a lot of the imagery everywhere. Black Panther, on the other hand, the throne room is very flat and lateral, and that also translates to how the king interacts with the women that he surrounded himself by because they have complementary skill sets that he doesn't have. It also translates to the Killmonger scene in the museum where cultural appropriation is called out, and one of the artifacts was actually Wakandan and was mislabeled by the institution as something else. And so the film itself is able to acknowledge the things that came before it that were inherently problematic, while still maintaining the very, very predominant narrative of a hero trying to navigate like an insurmountable problem and succeeding.
I'm going to deviate a little bit because, okay, can video games can it have its Black Panther moment is a very difficult question to ask because video games is so different from movies, yet there are so many overlaps, right? So, you know, Black Panther, lots of money was spent, of course, but the viewer is consuming this medium in like, what, 2 hours and 15 minutes, right? And you're done. So your expectations for like what a movie can do in 2.5 hours, and it's a superhero movie, so we already have our expectations. The beautiful thing about the video game industry is that there are so many different types of games and so many different ways to play and so many different types of players. There's your FPS, there's your first person, there's your puzzle people, there's your RPGs, there's your MMOs. Like I for one, my favorite games are immersive sims. So I mean the gaming having its Black Panther moment won't look like a game that is like really good with the representation of race or gender, because the beauty about games is that it, you know, a really good game has customization. Like think about Mass Effect. I mean, my Captain Shepard was so amazing, and you know, I could represent myself because the game allowed me this customization. I think that, you know, through narrative design, through diversity in teams that make games, and people holding the players and the team and the game makers accountable to where we want to be. Like our Black Panther moment is going to probably look like something different that doesn't have anything to do with our actual aesthetics. Like even VR, we can be a cat if we want to now. Like we all saw Ready Player One, and that movie had its problems, but you know, like imagine it being less problematic. It still kind of illustrates a world that exists in which we all can be on a level playing field, but our aesthetic is whatever we want it to be. So we're no longer thinking about race or gender or age or, you know, any of those things, because we can be an alligator. Like who you know, like who knows? So I don't know if that will ever quite happen that way.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're running out of time, but I did want like one last thing. I feel like when we were on the call, when we were preparing this panel, we talked about like we wanted everyone to at least walk away with one actionable item, one takeaway. So I wanted everyone on the panel to give one piece of advice that they can, like that they would tell the audience member what you can do to help increase diversity, or to help at least think about positivity around diversity. And I feel like one of the things that, you know, we talked about too that we didn't get to address here was that it's not just a top-down initiative. You know, it can start from everywhere, from bottom. I mean, it has to be both, I guess is the thing. It's not one or the other, right? And that everyone has the power to help make diversity better wherever they are. So, and
Can I say two things?
okay, two things.
Sweet. All right. So the first thing, I mean, the most achievable first step you can literally take is ask someone that you trust or someone you don't often talk to what your blind spots could be. Being aware of your bias is something that's really difficult to tackle because that requires us to be vulnerable, and that's squishy and that's hard. But being able to just acknowledge what you may not necessarily be noticing all the time is a really, really good first step. And the second is, if you're looking at the long-term systemic, how do I hire diverse people? I don't know where they are. Become a mentor, not only for the people that are already on your team, but local communities where they may have a programmatic gap, and there are diverse youth or disadvantaged communities who are looking for team tech centers, who are looking for people who can just provide youth access to adults who can tell them how to get into the video game industry. You'll be very surprised to see how much creativity can happen when they're just given the opportunity to do so.
My advice would be listen to your fans, listen to your customers. If people are complaining about your game or products, first you have to ask yourself, why are they complaining? And if you're trying to dismiss this complaint, it's possible you may have a bias. So you may want to ask around and saying, why are the fans saying this about my game? And you may find that there's some things about your game that to you might not be problematic, but to others it is.
I just would like a future in which I mean, I know this is probably a hard thing to say. People want to hire the best people with the best skills, but there is this robust, you know, sort of community of people that have skill sets, that have the passion, that have the loyalty even to work at game companies. But I don't think that the way people are hired is going to continue to work. And game companies need to be open to developing their talent and developing that diverse team that they want. It's so easy to just want to hire people prepackaged. And that is no longer going to be the way that you would do things if you actually truly want to advocate for diversity or have diversity in your team, fan base, so on and so forth.
Well said. Thank you very much to my amazing panelists. I hope this was a helpful discussion.
Yay.